All right, let's get the Board of Zoning Appeals meeting going this afternoon. Let's see. The first thing we'll do is roll call. Cicely?
Here.
Seth?
Here.
Mark?
Here.
Ron? Here. So we're just missing Kendra. Okay, and also we have Miss Rosalia, Amanda Harrington, and Amber Reyes. Also, just a reminder, we are being recorded. So when you are wanting to talk, make sure that you use the microphone. Also, if anyone in the audience wishes to speak, make sure you're signed up. And let's see. Approval of the minutes from last meeting. Y'all should all have a packet. Well, I'll give you a few minutes to look over that, and I'll entertain a motion to approve. I have a motion by Ron.
I'll second.
I have a second by Mark. And this is to approve the minutes as presented. Any other further discussion?
I don't see where it records that Paul had stepped down. Should we record it in this, at this point, in this, in these minutes, or no? I know that that wasn't the discussion point that he decided to make, but it was announced in this meeting. Should it be recorded in this meeting or no?
Well, we do have the election of the new chair. We could add that, saying that Paul Knudsen had stepped down due to relocation.
Maybe also mention that Miss Freddie,
So you would recommend saying that Freddie Banks has served her term? Thank you.
Anything else? So we'll approve the minutes. All those in favor say aye. All opposed say nay. The motion carries. The next thing is to approve the agenda. I'll entertain the motion to approve the agenda presented.
So moved.
Seconded.
First motion by Seth, second motion by Cicely. Any further discussion on the new agenda or anything? All those in favor say aye. All opposed say nay. Motion carries. Agenda is set. So the next thing is the public hearing. Do we have anyone in the audience that would wish to speak or anything like that? None? Okay. So that brings us to old business. Any old business? New business? Anything? They didn't show up. Okay, so Miss Harrington, is this where we start our training?
Yes, this is where we start our training. Okay, so last month we discussed the Tennessee Open Meetings Act, and before we start with conflict of interest laws, I wanted to just take a moment and see if anybody had any questions or anything since we've had a moment to reflect on the Tennessee Open Meetings Act. Does anybody have any questions on the Tennessee Open Meetings Act? Okay, well
Would
then,
you briefly review when you're allowed to speak about a meeting and when you're not?
sure. So with the Tennessee Open Meetings Act, let's see, we will get into that on best practices for compliance, which I think is slide, let me see. It's called best, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. I think it's going to be slide 11. It looks like best practices for compliance. It looks like this, it's this slide right here. This one. It's going to be in the very beginning. Yes, it's for under Tennessee Open Meetings Act. So discussing the best practices for compliance. So when we talked about when you can talk about meetings and when you can't, one of the best practices for compliance is not having any deliberation outside of the meeting. That includes serial meetings. Is that what you were along the lines of, Rosalie? Serial meetings and things like that. Okay. So no deliberation outside the meetings. And one common way that people get themselves into trouble is by having serial meetings. And serial meetings are meetings where one member calls another member to discuss a issue that's on the agenda. And then that member B, calls member C and talks about what member A and B talked about. And then member D, C, that's it right there. This one right here. You're close. Member D will call member E will call member F, and so on and so forth. So what ends up happening is you end up having a series of small meetings back to back, or even over a series of couple days. And that is a violation of the Tennessee Open Meetings Law. It doesn't have to be one big meeting. They can be a series of meetings that are smaller subsets of other meetings that are happening and other meeting conversations. This can also happen over email, especially when you do the reply all. That is one really good way to get yourselves in trouble inadvertently. Is if you get a correspondence from staff and it's got an informational item on a particular item on the agenda, and the agenda item is informational in nature. You know, this is a plat, this is maybe a brief history of it. You've seen something like this before, and this is going to be on your agenda for tonight's meeting. And someone hits reply all and says, well, we've seen this before. Why are we seeing this again? And someone else hits reply all and says, I agree. Why are we seeing something like this again? You've just had a serial meeting, because that can be contributing to deliberation of something that's on the agenda. Okay, so you need to be very careful about not having those type of meetings or conversations outside of a public forum. Now, there are going to be times when you get cornered at the grocery store or at church or out on Main Street or at the gas station when you're pumping, gasoline into your vehicle and you can't get away. It doesn't mean that you have to be unfriendly or rude. The best thing that you can do is listen politely and say, I understand your concern, but this is something that I can't discuss outside of a public meeting. It's important to remember that you all don't have constituents. You're not elected officials. You are appointees. For whatever reason, you were chosen to be on this board, and we are very grateful and glad that you're here. But you don't have you don't have an electorate to be responsive to. And that can be very difficult in the moment to remember, because they say, well, our taxpayers, our taxpayer dollars pay for you. Well, Not, well, we can talk about that. So, it's difficult in the moment to remember, but just, try to remember that any discussion about meetings need to happen in a public forum. Also remember that two members constitute a quorum. Doesn't have to be 3 of 5 or 4 of 5. Now, what about going to trainings? What about going to conferences? What about attending church all at the same place? That doesn't count. When you're in a place of worship or even in a training session somewhere, if you go to TML or MTAS meeting or a CTAS meeting, you're there for a purpose other than discussing items of local business. So that is generally considered safe as long as you keep it clean. Okay. As long as you're just really mindful about what you're talking about and making sure that it doesn't creep into, boy, that meeting was a doozy last night, wasn't it? Or can you believe what so-and-so said, and, let it devolve into those type of conversations. You're welcome.
I do have a quick question, though.
Yeah.
Just based off of my previous understanding of what was allowed and not allowed, is that we were allowed to discuss meetings after the meeting and verdict had already happened.
If it's a postmortem,
Okay.
yes.
So in the scenario that you just mentioned, like when you were in church and you were talking to them about, oh, that meeting last night was rough, that would still technically be okay because the meeting had passed.
And it passed, as
Okay.
long as nothing is still pending.
Sure, that makes
Right.
sense. Okay.
Thank you for that clarification. Yes, thank you for that. Yes. Any other questions on Tennessee Open Meetings Act before we get into conflicts of interest? Okay. So let's talk about conflicts of interest. So conflicts of interest, let me get my notes. So Tennessee conflict of interest statutes are intended to ensure that public officials act fairly, avoid improper influence, and maintain public trust in land use decisions. Because even the appearance of bias can undermine confidence and legal defensibility. Is everybody on the conflict of interest slide, first of all? Let's see. It looks like conflict of interest law in Tennessee. Let's see. Yeah. I'll make sure everybody gets there first so I don't get ahead of everybody. It's yeah, I've got my slides out of order here. Let's see if the meeting's act. It looks like this. It's this one. Okay. These laws emphasize disclosure, recusal, and in some cases, abstention when personal, financial, professional, or relational interests could affect or appear to affect judgment. The key issue is not wrongdoing, but whether impartiality could reasonably be called into question. Disclosure should occur early and on the record. Minor issues may be addressed through transparency, but financial interests, close relationships, or prior involvement typically require recusal. When uncertain, consulting legal counsel is advisable. If you'll go to your next slide called What is a Conflict of Interest? It looks like this. A helpful way to understand the framework is this. Impartiality supports public trust, and public trust supports defensible decisions. Conflict of interest laws exist to protect both the integrity of the decision and the credibility of the decision maker. Tennessee statutes, such as those found in TCA 817-101 and related provisions, outline when disclosure, recusal, or abstention may be required. These rules apply broadly to local government officials, including planning commission members and boards of zoning appeals, where land use decisions can significantly affect property values, development opportunities, and neighborhood character. A conflict of interest generally exists when a board member's personal, financial, professional, or relational interests could compromise or reasonably appear to compromise their ability to make an impartial decision on a matter before the board. Importantly, this includes 3 levels of concern: actual, potential, and perceived influence. In land use decision-making, perception carries significant weight. Even when no improper influence exists, the appearance of favoritism or bias can still undermine confidence in the process and invite challenges to decisions. Conflicts may arise from financial interest in affected property, business relationships with applicants, family or close personal connections, prior advocacy positions, or other circumstances where impartiality could reasonably be questioned. Because BZAs operate in a quasi-judicial capacity, similar to courts, the expectation of neutrality is particularly high. Planning commissions, while often legislative or advisory, must still maintain fairness and transparency, especially when handling site plans, rezonings, or other property-specific decisions. When a potential conflict exists, the safest recourse is typically early disclosure, followed by an evaluation of whether recusal is appropriate. Disclosure protects both the individual board member and the board by making a situation transparent. Recusal, stepping back from discussion and voting, may be necessary when impartiality could reasonably be questioned. This is not an admission of wrongdoing. It is a professional safeguard that demonstrates respect for due process and public confidence. Okay, your next slide, actual, potential, and perceived conflicts. Looks like this. An actual conflict exists when a board member has a direct personal, financial, or relational interest that could influence a decision today. For example, ownership of nearby property, a financial stake in a project, or a close business relationship with an applicant. These situations typically require clear disclosure and often recusal to protect both the decision maker and the integrity of the board's action. A potential conflict refers to circumstances where a conflict may not exist yet, but could reasonably develop in the future. This might include pending business relationships, anticipated property transactions, or professional connections that could later intersect with board decisions. Addressing potential conflicts proactively through disclosure helps prevent misunderstandings and protects the credibility of future decisions. Being transparent early allows boards to manage risks before they become legal or ethical problems. A perceived conflict centers on how the situation appears to the public, regardless of whether actual influence exists. In land use decision-making, perception carries significant weight because public trust depends on visible fairness. Even when a board member believes they can remain impartial, if a reasonable member of the public could question that impartiality, disclosure, and sometimes recusal may still be the prudent course. Courts, applicants, neighbors, and community stakeholders often focus on whether the process appears fair, not just whether it technically complies with the rules. So again, it's one of those situations where you get cornered in the grocery store or whatnot. It's all about appearances. If someone thinks that they've got your ear and they go telling somebody, oh, don't worry, I talked to Mark, I've got it all worked out. And that person goes and tells somebody, well, so-and-so talk to so-and-so, and we've got it all worked out. Don't worry about it. It's going to go our way. That stuff spreads like wildfire. And there goes your impartiality. And appearance is everything. Taken together, these three categories reinforce a core ethical principle for planning commissions and boards of zoning appeals. Maintaining impartiality protects not only the public, but also the board itself. Transparency, early disclosure, and careful judgment about participation help ensure decisions remain legally defensible, publicly credible, and consistent with adopted policies and ethical standards. Any questions so far? Yes, sir.
You're in a meeting and someone makes a comment that you hear for the first time, that then you realize I may be having a conflict of interest here. At what point in time is it you stop everything then and say it, or you let the guy finish what they're saying, and then when you get ready to vote, you just say, I have a conflict, I'm gonna recuse myself? How does that look?
So I think that's a really good question. I think as soon as you realize that there may be a potential for a conflict of interest, that you need to declare that. I wouldn't interrupt the person. I would let him finish or her finish their piece. But then I would say before anything goes too too much further, say point of order, Madam Chair or Mr. Chair, I believe that I may have a conflict of interest, and then declare what it is. And then you need to evaluate whether that conflict of interest is enough for you to need to recuse yourself, meaning you totally take yourself out of the process entirely. Or if the conflict is you're not really quite sure, but you still think that you can judge the application fairly, you state what your perceived conflict is, and you state, but I still think that I can fairly judge this application without bias. The other opportunity is to have the board decide whether or not it's enough of a conflict of interest to have you step back or not.
I think the latter would probably be the best, wouldn't you?
It all depends on the context. Unfortunately, there's not a one size fits all on this one. It's all very context sensitive.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Okay. So your next slide, the fundamental differences. Fundamental role difference, planning commissions, legislative advisory. I've lost my slide, so I can't show you what it looks like. I can't see that for us. It's too dark in here. Yes. So ethical standards for planning commissions and Board of Zoning Appeals flow directly from the legal role each body plays in Tennessee land use decision-making. Although both boards operate under public meeting laws, conflict of interest rules, and general governmental ethics requirements, the level of scrutiny applied to their actions differs because their statutory responsibilities are different. In simple terms, planning commissions help shape policy and guide growth, while boards of zoning appeals function more like courts reviewing specific cases. Why? Because you're a quasi-judicial board. Yes. That distinction drives how courts evaluate impartiality, fairness, and ethical conduct. BZAs hear variances, special exceptions, we're going to put a pin in that, and administrative appeals, decisions that directly affect specific property rights. When a BZA hears a case, it must apply ordinance standards to particular facts, weigh evidence, and make findings much like a trial court. Because of this judicial-like role, ethical expectations are significantly higher. Members must demonstrate neutrality, avoid ex parte communications. Does everybody remember what an ex parte communication is? No. Okay, an ex parte communication is when you're having a conversation with somebody that not everybody is privileged to hear. So it's that conversation that you have outside of the public forum. It's that private conversation that you don't disclose to everybody else. That's what an ex parte communication is. Let's see. Avoid ex parte communications, disclose conflicts promptly, and recuse when impartiality could reasonably be questioned. Note that he keeps saying reasonably be questioned. That's an interesting term, isn't it? Reasonably be questioned. It's not just be questioned, because anybody can come in and question. Anybody can come in and accuse, right? But the courts use reasonably be questioned. I find that very interesting. I think that's to try to make a balance between somebody coming in and just accusing somebody every single meeting of being biased and crooked and taking bribes and, being otherwise, mischievous and and misbehaved versus somebody who comes in with a well thought out saying, look, I've got proof that this happened. I've got, X, Y, and Z that this actually happened. And this is what I believe, and this is why I believe it. So I think that's kind of an interesting way that it's phrased. But even the appearance of bias can undermine a BZA decision because due process requires not only fairness, but the perception of fairness. This difference in legal function explains why ethical standards are often described as stricter for BZAs. A planning commission member discussing general policy trends outside a meeting may raise transparency concerns, but a BZA member discussing a pending variance case privately could create a due process violation. Because remember, you guys, not only, you're a quasi judicial board, you're dealing with your ordinances and resolutions here, but you're also dealing with people's constitutional rights to be heard. Right? All right. Similarly, a planning commission member with a minor perceived conflict might resolve it through disclosure, whereas a BZA member in a comparable situation must often recuse to protect the integrity of the adjudicative process. So from a practical standpoint, applying BZA level ethics consistently, even when serving on a planning commission, is usually the safest course. Okay, so if we go to our next slide, how courts review each body. A board of zoning appeals functions much more like a court. When hearing variances or administrative appeals, the BZA applies law to specific facts affecting individual property rights. These are quasi-judicial proceedings, which means due process standards apply. Members must remain neutral, base decisions only on the evidence presented at the hearing, avoid off-record communications, those are those ex parte communications we were talking about, and prevent even the appearance of bias. Courts expect BZA members to act more like judges than policymakers, and they scrutinize conflicts, ex parte communications, and prejudgment far more closely. A helpful way to explain this is the judge hat concept. If you're wearing your judge hat, ethical expectations tighten dramatically. That hat is worn every time a BZA hears a case. When members internalize that idea, you're much less likely to engage in off-record conversations, express premature opinions, or overlook potential conflicts. This distinction matters because many violations occur when BZA hearings are treated like planning commission discussions. When experienced commissioners join a BZA without retraining, or when local governments fail to clearly explain the difference between policy decisions and quasi-judicial decisions. Explicit training on this point helps prevent due process violations, Open Meetings Act problems, court reversals, and erosion of public confidence. The simplest takeaway to teach is this. Policy boards require transparency and fairness, but quasi-judicial boards like you all require neutrality and restraint. When unsure which standard applies, follow the more strict one. That approach protects the board, the decision, the local government, and the public's confidence in the process. All right, let's go to disclosure versus recusal. It looks like this one. Disclosure and recusal are essential safeguards for ethical decision-making, public trust, and legally defensible land use decisions. While they are related, they serve different purposes. Disclosure informs the public and the board of potential conflict, while recusal removes a member from participation when impartiality could reasonably be questioned. Disclosure promotes transparency, but it does not always eliminate a conflict. Recusal may still be necessary, especially in quasi-judicial decisions. Disclosure should occur as soon as a potential conflict becomes known and before deliberation begins. Common examples include property ownership near a project, business relationships with applicants, prior professional involvement, personal relationships with affected parties, ex parte communications, or public statements suggesting a predetermined position. Importantly, the standard is often the appearance of bias, not just actual bias. Ultimately, disclosure and recusal are not admissions of wrongdoing. They are professional safeguards. I think I've said that 2 or 3 times already, but I want you guys to really internalize that. It's a safeguard. You're not saying that you've done something wrong or that something wrong has occurred. It's a safeguard. A strong ethical culture encourages timely disclosure, careful documentation, ongoing training, and a simple guiding principle. When impartiality might reasonably be questioned, disclose promptly. When fairness could be compromised, recusal protects both the decision and the public trust.
I've got a question.
Yes, ma'am.
In the scenario where you are a neighbor or business partner or something along those lines, obviously you would disclose it and everything, but would you still be available as a citizen, as a private citizen, to be able to just come up and state your case for or against, even though you're not on the board in that scenario, you're a member of the public?
So as we've gotten into some situations like this before, if you recuse early in the very beginning and you step away from your seat and you physically go sit in the audience and you stay completely out of deliberation, and if you choose to get up and speak and you say, I am, and then you say your name, you say your address, just like everybody else does, and you state you are speaking as a member of the general public, and you make it very clear, then you can. It's not often advised to do that though, because you can still be seen as influencing your fellow board members. Because it's kind of like the term lipstick on a pig, still a pig, you're still a board member. You still have influence. So it's, now, does that mean that, it's just not advisable?
What about a significant other? Could if the person would recuse themselves, take themselves out and make it be known that they have a conflict of interest, they're no longer involved in the decision-making or anything like that, could the person's spouse then speak to this scenario of the situation that they have a conflict with or support of?
Well, if you've got a conflict of interest, your spouse would have a conflict of interest. There would still be a conflict of interest present. The spouse could. You're still splitting hairs. You're splitting that hair awfully fine. Understood. Sometimes in situations like that, if it's, if there's a neighborhood group or, something to that effect, sometimes it's best to let somebody else deliver the message. Yeah.
I've got one.
Yes, sir.
And we have an ordinance that says that it's legal to do that. But you feel like, hey, this is still not a good idea, even though it's legal.
Mm-hmm.
Am I wrong in saying I'm gonna vote no for this, even though it's the law and it's legally to do this, or should I just not vote at all?
So you've got an internal struggle
Yes.
with something that your ordinance says.
That's right.
So in situations like that, you can abstain from voting, but you have to say why you're abstaining from voting. Abstention is not supposed to be something for a moral or a conflict like that,
Mhm.
because then everybody can figure out something that they're not comfortable with and abstain for any reason. Those are supposed to be for really, for conflicts of interest and recusal and things like that. There are going to be times that you don't agree with things that are in the ordinance, but the law is the law.
Hold the law.
Uphold the law. Now, there are times where you can vote no, because you don't agree with the ordinance. And then you could say in discussion, maybe something to the effect of giving staff direction and go, look, I'm really not comfortable with this. Is there a way the staff could research what other communities do in situations, with whatever section of the resolution you're not comfortable with? Something to that effect, to kind of explain your rationale for why you're voting the way that you're voting.
Mhm.
But I don't think that would necessarily rise to a conflict of interest under these particular definitions.
Thank you.
Sure. Great question. Okay, any other questions? Okay. So recusal. Let's see, yeah. Recusal means, let's see, have we done that one yet? We didn't. Okay, we didn't do that one yet, okay. And we're at 6:40. Okay. Recusal means the legal basis for recusal centers on fairness and the appearance of impartiality. Courts reviewing land use decisions, particularly quasi-judicial decisions made by boards of zoning appeals, focus heavily on whether the process appeared fair. Even without actual bias, the appearance of bias can be enough to invalidate a decision. Because BZAs act similarly to courts when deciding variances or appeals affecting property rights, members are expected to demonstrate judge-like neutrality. While planning commissions sometimes act in a legislative or advisory capacity where disclosure may occasionally suffice for minor issues, boards of zoning appeals generally face stricter due process expectations. What might be manageable through disclosure in a legislative context often requires recusal in a quasi-judicial setting. Proper recusal procedures should be clear and documented. The member should state the recusal on the record before discussion begins, briefly explain the reason, refrain from participation, and allow staff to record the recusal in the minutes. Recusal can affect quorum calculations, sometimes require deferral of an item or use of alternates if permitted. A simple guiding principle applies. If a reasonable person could question your impartiality, stepping aside helps preserve fairness, credibility, and public trust. Lots of public trust in this. All right, common conflict scenarios looks like this. Financial conflicts are typically the clearest basis for recusal. These include ownership of the subject property, financial ties to the applicant, employment or contractual relationships, or any potential economic benefit tied to the outcome. For both planning commissions and BZAs, these situations almost always require recusal. Because BZAs operate in a quasi-judicial capacity, courts often apply stricter impartiality standards, making recusal especially important. Property proximity can be more nuanced. Owning nearby property or having business interest in the affected area may require disclosure and, in some cases, recusal, particularly for BZAs where decisions directly affect individual property rights. For planning commissions acting in a more legislative role, disclosure may occasionally suffice if the interest is widely shared with the public, but caution remains advisable. Family relationships and close personal connections almost always require recusal. When applicants or affected parties include close relatives, business partners, close friends, or known adversaries. Known adversaries. The appearance of bias can undermine confidence in the decision regardless of actual intent. Predetermination or apparent bias can also require recusal. Public statements indicating a fixed position before hearing evidence, advocacy outside official meetings, also known as social media, y'all, social media. We talked about that last time. Advocacy outside official meetings or comments suggesting the outcome is predetermined can jeopardize due process, particularly in quasi-judicial BZA decisions. Ex parte communications or private discussions about pending matters may require disclosure and sometimes recusal if substantive information was exchanged outside the public record. Transparency is essential to maintain fairness and defensibility. It's equally important to recognize what does not automatically constitute a conflict. General familiarity with an area, prior board service, participation in properly noticed deliberations, or voting consistently with adopted plans and regulations are not conflicts by themselves. A true conflict typically involves a personal interest or circumstance that could reasonably call impartiality into question.
So I have a question.
Yes.
With me being chair
Mhm.
and say I have a family member that is building houses or have an issue with me being chair, how does that same thing apply with me?
Yes.
Okay. That's what I was just trying to figure out.
Yes, because you could be viewed as influencing your board. It could be facial expressions, it could be eyes, it could be posture, it could be any number of things. Yes. Okay, how to cure conflicts of interest. It looks like this. At a high level, the process begins with disclosure. When a member becomes aware of a potential conflict, whether financial, personal, relational, professional, or even just perceived, it should be disclosed openly on the record before any discussion, deliberation, or voting occurs. Does that answer your question before? Yeah, yeah. This transparency allows the public, staff, and fellow board members to understand the situation and ensures the meeting record reflects that the issue was addressed responsibly. The next step is determining whether disclosure alone is sufficient or whether recusal is required. For boards of zoning appeals, which act in a quasi-judicial role like a court, disclosure alone is rarely enough if any reasonable question of impartiality exists. Because BZA decisions involve specific property rights and due process considerations, the standard for neutrality is much higher. I know I'm starting to sound repetitive, but it's really important.
Well, it did make me want to question
Yes.
something.
Sure.
So if you do recuse yourself, does that mean that you are not allowed to be at the meeting? Or does that mean that you're not allowed to be at the front of the meeting? You can sit in the audience?
So when you recuse yourself, you remove yourself, if at all possible, from your seat. You go sit down for the remainder of that item, and then when it's done, then you can come back and take your seat. Yes. The best practice is to physically leave the dais when practicable, so there's no appearance of influence. Partial participation is not permitted. Members cannot disclose a conflict and then continue to shape the conversation. Even subtle cues, such as body language or off-the-record conversations, can create concerns about fairness. Following this approach protects multiple interests simultaneously. It protects the board by preserving the legitimacy of its actions, the decision by ensuring procedural fairness, the local government by reducing exposure to appeals or litigation, and the individual member by preventing allegations of misconduct or bias. Ultimately, careful conflict management reinforces confidence that land use decisions are being made open, ethically, and in the public interest. All right, court review of conflicts. 647. All right. When courts review conflicts of interest involving planning commissions or BZAs, their primary focus on whether the decision-making process was fair, impartial, and consistent with due process. Courts generally care less about intent or whether the final outcome seems reasonable, and more about whether the process itself maintained both actual fairness and appearance of fairness. Look, y'all, judges are not land use experts. I know, it's shocking. They're not going to read your resolution. They're not going to go through that level. What they're going to do, they're going to read your meeting minutes, and they're going to look at how you conducted yourself. Okay, they may review tapes, maybe. Depends on your judge. Everything about how you conduct yourself during these meetings is going to be reviewed. Everything about your meeting minutes is going to be reviewed. That's why it is absolutely crucial and critical that these meeting minutes are accurate and timely, meaning don't get months and months behind like some communities I deal with. Not you all. You all are great. You are to be commended for your meeting minutes and everything. But no joke, they're not going to be looking at the merits of the case. They're not going to decide whether you made a right decision or a wrong decision. They're going to look at how you came to your decision. Okay? The way you conduct yourself is of utmost importance, outside the meeting and inside the meeting. That's the main takeaway for tonight. A common outcome when a conflict is identified is that the court invalidates or voids the decision. This could occur if a conflicted member participated in discussion, questioning, deliberation, or voting. Courts usually do not assess whether the member's participation changed the final vote. Instead, they evaluate whether the integrity of the process was compromised. If procedural fairness is undermined, the decision may not stand regardless of its substantive merits. Courts frequently remand cases for rehearing, meaning the matter is returned to the board for a new hearing conducted in accordance with proper procedures. This often includes ensuring full disclosure of conflicts, appropriate recusals, proper notice, and reliance strictly on the public record. Rehearings can be disruptive, requiring additional staff time, renewed public participation, and careful rebuilding of findings and documentation. Now you tell me, if you've already been dinged once for bias and you're sent back to rehear it, how are you not already biased? You've already heard the case once. How is that not a catch-22? How does that not make your job infinitely harder than it already is? So let's do it right the first time. Like you are, like you have been doing. So again, when a conflict is found, courts may also examine broader procedural issues such as ex parte communications, inadequate notice, weak findings of fact, or evidence of prejudgment. A single conflict can therefore expose larger weaknesses in board procedures. If you give a mouse a cookie, you got to give them milk, right? If you give them one thing to look at, they're going to crack the entire case open. They're going to look at everything you do, including what staff is doing. Consistent ethics training, strong documentation practices, and clear procedural guidance help minimize these risks. Courts rarely accept harmless error arguments in conflict of interest cases. Claims that the vote would have passed anyway, that no harm occurred, or that a member abstained late in the process usually do not resolve due process concerns. Procedural fairness is treated as foundational, not optional. Importantly, courts do not substitute their judgment on planning merits. They typically do not decide whether to approve a subdivision, variance, or rezoning. Instead, their role is to ensure that legal procedures are followed and that the decision-making process is fair, transparent, and impartial. When those standards are not met, the remedy usually focuses on correcting the process rather than evaluating the substance of the land use decision. Okay, let's see here. How to cure conflicts of interest. 6:51. Can I have 2 more minutes, Rosalie and Mr. Chair? How to cure? I can skip that one if you'd like. I think I can probably skip over. Let me go to language from the dais real quick, if that's okay, if I can have 2 more minutes. Okay, language from the dais. What is said from the dais during Planning Commission and Board of Zoning Appeals meetings is not casual conversation. It becomes part of the legal record. Every comment is public, recorded, and potentially reviewed by courts, attorneys, and the public. Judges often look beyond the final vote to examine questions asked, statements made, tone, and whether members appeared fair and impartial. Because of this, dais language can make or break a decision on appeal. Even when a board reaches the legally correct outcome, careless language can suggest bias, predetermination, or reliance on improper factors, which may lead to a remand or reversal. BZAs. They apply existing ordinances to specific property rights cases such as variances and appeals. Because you function more like courts, your language is scrutinized more strictly. Statements suggesting bias, prejudgment, or reliance on information outside the hearing can be especially damaging in your proceedings. Bias or personal preference statements, including remarks about what types of development members like or don't want, imply decisions are being based on taste rather than adopted standards. References to improper factors such as unsupported property value claims or speculation about public reaction can undermine findings. Statements hinting at ex parte communications raise due process concerns. Dismissive, sarcastic, or hostile comments can also create a record of unfair treatment that courts take very seriously. Strong dais language, by contrast, is neutral, professional, and grounded in adopted standards. It focuses on ordinance criteria, evidence in the record, and clarifying questions rather than opinions. Phrases like, based on section 3.05 of the ordinance, or can staff clarify how this meets the required criteria, or the evidence presented tonight suggests, demonstrate careful adherence to legal obligations. This type of language signals to courts that the board followed proper process and based its decision on the law rather than personal preference. Questions should also be framed carefully. Questions that seek clarification, reference ordinance criteria, and remain open-ended help build a strong record. Questions that assume facts not in evidence, suggest a desired outcome, or introduce personal opinion can weaken the decision. The goal is always to develop a clear, fair record that shows the board considered all relevant information without bias. Findings of fact are especially important for BZA decisions. Courts rely heavily on whether findings connect directly to ordinance standards and are supported by evidence. If the written findings are strong, but the meeting record shows biased or emotional comments, the decision may still be vulnerable. In other words, what members say can undermine what the board later writes. The chair plays a critical role in protecting the record. Effective chairs redirect inappropriate comments, remind members to reference standards, prevent argumentative cross-examination, maintain a respectful tone, and keep deliberations focused on the applicable criteria. Simple resets, such as reminding the board to focus on ordinance standards or the evidence presented, can protect the integrity of the proceeding. And with that, I thank you all very much for your time.
I do have a question. You did say that you were putting a pin into the special exceptions.
Yes,
Is there an easy?
no.
Okay, there we go.
Well, thank you again for this training. I know it is a lot of information and stuff, but didn't you say that you were going to send Rosalie something? You said you were going to record this or something and send it to Rosalie?
I have a recorded one. It's a 2 hour, it's a 2 hour one, but it covers a lot of what we've already covered.
Gotcha.
I'm afraid it would be more repetitive for you all at this point.
Okay, report from the building official.
So things have not slowed down. There are still lots of building going on, though it is more towards accessory structure, which means shops, garages, in-ground swimming pools, things of that nature. So you're not really going to be seeing much of an impact from impact fees, which are dealing with single-family residents and things of that nature. But there is quite a bit of building still going on. And I'm happy to say that we are nearing having our field house totally complete. So stay tuned. That is coming.
Excuse me. All right, does anybody have any comments or anything like that? Well, if not, then I'll entertain a motion to adjourn. Oh, sure. Seth Thurman, go ahead.
I'm happy to be here. Thank you for having me. Yeah,
Thank you, Seth, for agreeing to serve on this
Yeah.
quasi judicial committee.
I appreciate that. Excited to serve. Thank you.
Thank you, Ron. And we're happy to have you, Seth. So I'll entertain a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
Motion by Seth,
Second.
second by Ron. All those in favor say aye. We stand adjourned.